It was the kind of love story that people only dream about, grand, dazzling, and almost too perfect to believe. A young girl, wide-eyed and full of innocence, meets a man who seems to embody everything she could ever want. This wasn't the kind of romance you stumbled across every day. No, this was larger than life. Emma Rhodes was just 15 years old when Daniel Parker entered her life, a man whose presence was so magnetic it could silence a room. He was no ordinary man. He was a 27-year-old pilot, a man who had conquered the skies and now seemed intent on conquering her heart. Daniel wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of wealthy that made people take notice. His suits were tailored, his watch gleamed with understated sophistication, and his every move radiated control. He didn't just enter Emma's world, he reshaped it, tilting her quiet, simple life into something unrecognizable. He arrived with grand gestures, the kind that left no room for doubt about his intentions. He flew his helicopter over her school one afternoon, a bold, breathtaking act that had everyone talking. The other girls could only watch in awe, but Emma was the one he wanted. In that moment, it felt like a dream, the kind of moment you replay in your mind over and over again, unable to believe it's real. For Emma, a teenager still figuring out her place in the world, Daniel was everything she didn't even know she wanted. He was older, confident, worldly, and, above all, he chose her. He told her she was different, that she was special, that he saw something in her that no one else could. And she believed him. How could she not? Daniel spoke with such conviction, such certainty, that she couldn't help but get swept up in the fantasy he was crafting for her. Their relationship moved quickly, too quickly, some would say. Her parents were hesitant, her friends unsure, but Emma didn't care. In her eyes, Daniel was the man of her dreams. He promised her a life of adventure and luxury, a life where she'd never have to worry about the mundane realities of her small-town existence. And so, when he asked her to leave everything behind and marry him, she didn't hesitate. At just 18 years old, Emma became Mrs. Daniel Parker, trading her childhood for a future that seemed to glitter with endless possibilities. The wedding was far from traditional. There were no family members or friends gathered to celebrate, no laughter echoing through the halls of a grand reception. Instead, it was a quiet, private ceremony in a foreign country, just the two of them. At the time, Emma thought it was romantic, a testament to how deeply Daniel loved her. He didn't want to share her with the world, he wanted her all to himself. It was only later that she would realize this was just the beginning of his need for control. When they returned home, Emma was thrust into a life that felt like a fairy tale. Daniel's wealth afforded them a beautiful house in an affluent neighborhood, the kind of place Emma had only seen in magazines. He showered her with gifts, planned elaborate trips, and posted photos of their picture-perfect life on social media. To the outside world, they were the ideal couple, young, beautiful, and deeply in love. But those close to Emma began to notice subtle changes. She stopped visiting her friends, rarely called her family, and seemed to fade into the background of her own life. Daniel had become the center of her universe, and everything revolved around him. For a while, Emma convinced herself that this was just how marriage worked. She ignored the growing discomfort, the little voice in the back of her mind telling her that something wasn't right. After all, Daniel was everything she thought she wanted. He was charming, successful, and attentive, at least when it suited him. But behind closed doors, cracks began to form in the carefully constructed image of their relationship. Daniel's need for control became suffocating. He dictated what she wore, who she spoke to, and how she spent her days. He kept a close eye on their finances, even taking money that Emma's mother sent to her. It was as though he had systematically cut her off from the world, leaving her entirely dependent on him. Emma began to document her feelings in a diary, the only place where she could be honest about the life she was living. She wrote about the fights, the tears, and the growing sense of isolation. She questioned her decision to marry Daniel, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. In one entry, she admitted that she loved him too much to leave, even though the relationship was slowly breaking her. Another entry, written shortly after the birth of their daughter, revealed her desperation. "I stayed with him so my daughter wouldn't grow up without two parents," she wrote, her words heavy with resignation. As time went on, Emma's dreams of a happy life with Daniel began to crumble. The man she had once seen as her savior now felt like her captor. She made plans to leave, to take her daughter and start over, but every time she came close, something held her back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the hope that things would get better. Whatever it was, it kept her trapped in a life that was far from the fairy tale she had imagined. And then, one fateful night, everything came to a head. The man who had promised to love and protect her would reveal his true nature in the most horrifying way imaginable. The perfect life Daniel had crafted for Emma wasn't just a lie, it was a carefully orchestrated illusion, designed to hide the darkness that lay within him. By the time the truth came to light, it would be too late for Emma. What began as a story of love and devotion would end in betrayal and tragedy, leaving behind a chilling legacy that no one could have foreseen. This is the story of Emma Rhodes, a young woman who fell in love with the wrong man, and Daniel Parker, the husband who pulled off the ultimate betrayal. In the early hours of May 11, 2021, the quiet, affluent neighborhood of Fairview Hills, just outside Athens, Georgia, was plunged into chaos. The tranquility of the pre-dawn hours was shattered by a frantic 911 call from Daniel Parker, a man who claimed his home had been invaded by masked intruders. His voice was muffled and strained as he pleaded for help, barely intelligible, he later explained, because his mouth was bound with duct tape. He managed to dial the number using only his nose, a desperate act, he said, to save his family after a night of terror. Daniel's account of the events was horrifying. According to his story, at around 4:30 a.m., 3 men wearing dark clothing and masks forced their way into the home. They were armed and aggressive, wasting no time in overpowering him. He described how they tied his hands and feet, blindfolded him with layers of duct tape, and left him helpless on the floor of the master bedroom. His wife, Emma, had been sleeping beside him when the intruders barged in, and their 11-month-old daughter, Lily, was in a nearby crib. The men demanded money, shouting at Emma and Daniel in thick, accented voices. They threatened to harm the baby if they didn't cooperate. Daniel claimed the intruders tore through the house in a frenzy, appending drawers, breaking furniture, and scattering belongings across the floors. They weren't subtle, they were methodical and focused, as though they knew exactly what they were looking for. When Emma tried to reason with them, offering to show them where the money was hidden, they silenced her with shouts and threats. The fear in her voice, Daniel later recalled, was something he would never forget. The men eventually found the cash, hidden in an unlikely spot, a Monopoly board game box stashed in the closet. It was $10,000. Money the couple had been saving for their future. Along with the cash, the intruders took $20,000 worth of Emma's jewelry, including pieces that had been passed down from her grandmother. But even after securing the valuables, they didn't leave. Daniel claimed the men became increasingly erratic, as though the adrenaline of the robbery had overtaken them. They began demanding more, yelling at Emma to tell them where she had hidden the rest of their money. At some point, the chaos turned deadly. Daniel, still bound and unable to move, said he could hear Emma's terrified pleas. She begged them to leave her baby alone, promising there was nothing else of value in the house. But the men wouldn't listen. Daniel said he heard a struggle, followed by muffled cries. He couldn't see what was happening, but the sound of his wife's voice was replaced by an eerie silence. When the intruders finally fled, they left behind a scene of devastation. Daniel described how, after regaining consciousness from what he claimed were moments of fainting caused by the tight restraints around his neck, he realized the house had gone quiet. The baby's cries echoed through the room, and it was then that he knew Emma was gone. Still unable to move, he used his nose to nudge his phone across the floor until he could dial 911. The call was brief and chaotic, with Daniel struggling to explain the situation through the tape covering his mouth. "Robbers came in," he said over and over, his words barely audible. When first responders arrived at the Parker residence, they were met with a scene that could only be described as horrific. The house was in complete disarray, furniture overturned, drawers emptied, and belongings strewn across every room. The Monopoly box, its lid flung open, lay on the floor of the living room. But the most chilling discovery was upstairs in the master bedroom. Emma was found lying face down on the bed, her body motionless and cold. The baby, Lily, was beside her, crying and reaching out to her mother, as though trying to wake her. Emma's face showed clear signs of suffocation. It was later determined that she had been smothered with a pillow, a process that would have taken several excruciating minutes. Her injuries also suggested a struggle, bruises on her arms and wrists indicated that she had fought back. The baby, though unharmed physically, was visibly distressed, her cries piercing the silence of the crime scene. Nearby, Daniel was found on the floor, his hands and feet bound tightly with rope, his eyes and mouth covered in duct tape. He appeared dazed and disoriented, but his physical condition seemed to pale in comparison to the shock and grief he displayed upon being freed. He wept uncontrollably as officers informed him of Emma's death, repeating over and over that he had tried to save her. The family dog, Max, was discovered in the stairwell, strangled with its own leash, a cruel and calculated act that left responders shaken. As investigators began piecing together the events of the night, Daniel's account seemed both tragic and plausible. The brutality of the crime, the thoroughness with which the house had been ransacked, and the loss of Emma and Max painted a grim picture of a premeditated home invasion gone horribly wrong. Yet, even in the immediate aftermath, there were questions. Why had the intruders resorted to murder when they had already taken what they wanted? Why had they killed the dog, a seemingly unnecessary act of cruelty? And why was there no sign of forced entry at the front door? As investigators would soon discover, the truth behind the events of that night was far more complex, and far more shocking, than anyone could have anticipated. Emma Rhodes hadn't just been the victim of a random act of violence. She had been betrayed in the most unimaginable way, by the very person who had vowed to protect her. When first responders entered the Parker home, it was clear they had walked into a crime scene that would haunt them for years to come. The house was in complete chaos. Furniture was overturned, cushions slashed open, and drawers yanked from dressers and dumped onto the floor. Papers, clothing, and personal items were scattered across every room, as if someone had gone through the house meticulously but in a blind rage at the same time. The sheer level of destruction painted a picture of either desperation or a calculated effort to send a message. It was hard to tell which. As officers moved further into the home, their attention turned to the chilling discovery in the stairwell. Max, the family's white and brown Labrador mix, lay lifeless. The leash that had once been used to take him for walks now hung tightly around his neck. The act felt deeply personal, cruel, and unnecessary. Killing a defenseless dog in such a way suggested either extreme anger or someone intent on showing complete domination over the household. Max's death was the first real indication that whoever had been in the house wasn't just after money, they wanted to leave a scar, a reminder of their power. The scene in the master bedroom, however, eclipsed anything else found in the house. Emma was lying face down on the bed, her long hair spread across the pillow. Her body was still, pale, and lifeless. Her arms were positioned awkwardly, as though she had tried to fight back but had been overpowered. Around her neck were faint marks, as if a hand had pressed down during the struggle. The pillow that had been used to smother her lay discarded nearby, a silent witness to the violence that had taken place. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the weight of her final moments. Beside her, Lily, the couple's 11-month-old daughter, sat crying. Her tiny hands reached out to Emma, patting her back in an innocent, heartbreaking attempt to wake her mother. It was an image that struck even the most seasoned officers, many of whom had to look away. The baby, while unharmed physically, seemed traumatized. Her cries echoed through the house, filling the silence left in the wake of the attack. Daniel was found on the floor of the same room. His hands and feet were tightly bound with nylon rope, and his face was partially obscured by duct tape that had been hastily wrapped around his mouth and eyes. He appeared weak, dazed, and barely conscious. As officers cut through his restraints, he collapsed into sobs, his body shaking as he processed the horror around him. He kept repeating Emma's name, his voice cracking as he asked over and over again if she was okay. When the truth was gently explained to him, that Emma had been killed, Daniel let out a wail of anguish so loud and raw that it reverberated through the house. The baby's cries grew louder in response, a sorrowful duet of loss. Daniel's story was simple but harrowing. He described being jolted awake by the sound of intruders bursting into the bedroom. They had weapons, masks, and thick accents, possibly Eastern European, he thought. He was overpowered before he could even sit up. They tied him, blindfolded him, and shoved him onto the floor. He claimed he couldn't see what happened next but could hear everything. He heard Emma's screams, her pleas for their daughter's safety, and the muffled sounds of the men ransacking the house. He said he fainted at one point, only to regain consciousness to the sound of his baby crying and the realization that Emma wasn't making a sound anymore. It was then, he said, that he managed to nudge his phone onto the floor and dial 911 using his nose. As investigators began piecing together the events of the night, their initial theory was that this was a premeditated robbery. The intruders seemed to know exactly where to look for the hidden cash, $10,000 stashed inside a Monopoly box in the living room closet. They also seemed intent on finding additional valuables, taking Emma's jewelry, including family heirlooms worth approximately $20,000. The violence, while horrifying, appeared to be a tactic to intimidate the family into compliance. Emma's death, in this theory, was an unfortunate escalation, possibly the result of her fighting back or trying to protect her child. The murder of the dog was seen as an act meant to show the intruder's ruthlessness. Using Daniel's description of the men, investigators worked with a forensic artist to create a composite sketch of one of the suspects. He was described as tall, heavy-set, and dark-skinned, with a broad face and a deep voice. Daniel had also been able to identify their weapons, a black semi-automatic pistol and a silver revolver. The level of detail he provided, despite his disoriented state, was unusual and raised some eyebrows among the investigators, but at the time, there was no reason to doubt his account. The crime scene was meticulously documented, with officers collecting what little evidence the intruders had left behind. Strangely, there were no fingerprints, no footprints, and no DNA left at the scene, a fact that puzzled the team. For a robbery that appeared so chaotic, the lack of physical evidence was surprising. The one clue they did have was a black fabric hood found near the stairwell, which they believed might have fallen off one of the intruders during the struggle. It was sent to the lab for analysis, though expectations for a breakthrough were low. Despite the brutal nature of the crime, investigators found themselves grappling with unanswered questions. If the intruders had gotten what they wanted, the cash and jewelry, why had they stayed long enough to kill Emma and the dog? Why was Daniel left alive, when his description of them could compromise their escape? And how had they known about the money in the Monopoly box? To the seasoned detectives on the case, something about the scene didn't feel quite right. As one officer later put it, it was almost too clean for something so messy. As the investigation continued, cracks in the narrative began to form. What initially seemed like a horrifying home invasion would soon reveal itself to be something far more calculated. The answers would lie not in what the intruders had done, but in the man who had claimed to be their victim. Emma Rhodes was born in Savannah, Georgia, a city known for its charming squares and historic beauty, but her childhood unfolded in the sleepy coastal town of Spring Haven. The town was small, nestled along the shoreline, where the days were slow, and the nights were filled with the rhythmic sounds of waves lapping against the shore. Emma loved everything about it. She loved the salt air that clung to her skin, the way the ocean sparkled under the afternoon sun, and the endless possibilities the water seemed to hold. She grew up in a modest home with her parents, Mark and Linda Rhodes, and her younger brother, Ethan. Her father worked long hours at the local marina, and her mother, a schoolteacher, spent her evenings grading papers at the kitchen table. They weren't wealthy, but they were happy in their simplicity. Emma was a spirited child, full of curiosity and wonder. She spent her summers at the beach, swimming until her skin was salty and sun-kissed, or exploring tide pools with Ethan, uncovering tiny crabs and shells she imagined were treasures. As she grew older, her love for the ocean turned into a passion for marine biology. She dreamed of studying the mysteries of the deep, of one day working to protect the waters that had shaped her childhood. Her family encouraged her dreams, even if the path seemed distant for a small-town girl. Her father would tell her, "You can do anything, Em," and for a while, she believed it. But like many teenagers, Emma's focus began to shift as she entered high school. And that's when Daniel Parker came into her life. Emma first saw Daniel during the annual Spring Haven Summer Festival. It was one of those sticky July evenings where the entire town gathered along the boardwalk for food, music, and fireworks. Daniel, then 27, was there visiting his parents, who owned a vacation home in the area. He stood out immediately. He wasn't like the boys Emma knew from school. Daniel was polished, confident, and carried himself with a sophistication that seemed otherworldly in their small town. He was a pilot, a man who flew helicopters for a living, and that alone gave him an air of adventure and excitement that captivated everyone who met him. For Emma, who had spent her life in a town where nothing ever changed, Daniel was like a window into a world she had only dreamed of. He was charming in a way that felt effortless, with a deep, warm voice and a smile that could disarm even the most guarded person. But it wasn't just his looks or his profession that drew her in, it was the attention he gave her. He told her she was beautiful, that she had a spark he had never seen in anyone else. He made her feel special in a way no one else ever had. Their relationship moved quickly. Daniel would take her on long drives along the coast, tell her stories about his travels, and promise her a life filled with excitement and luxury. One day, he flew his helicopter over her school, circling the field as students spilled out of the building to watch in awe. It was a gesture so grand, so outrageous, that it left Emma breathless. To her, it felt like a fairy tale. She was just a teenager, barely old enough to understand the complexities of love, and here was this older, successful man sweeping her off her feet. She fell for him completely, blinded by the charm and the promise of a life that seemed so far removed from the quiet simplicity of Spring Haven. By the time Emma turned 18, Daniel had convinced her to marry him. They eloped in a small, private ceremony in Savannah, with no family or friends present. At the time, Emma thought it was romantic, just the two of them, declaring their love without anyone else's approval or interference. But in reality, it was the first step in Daniel's plan to isolate her from everyone she knew. After the wedding, they moved into Daniel's home in Fairview Hills, a sprawling, elegant house that felt more like a museum than a place to live. It was nothing like the cozy, cluttered home Emma had grown up in. The rooms were cold and pristine, with expensive furniture and artwork that felt untouchable. At first, Emma tried to see it as a fresh start, a new chapter in her life. But as the months passed, she began to feel more like a guest in Daniel's world than his wife. Daniel's charm didn't fade, but it began to change. The man who had once made her feel like the center of the universe now seemed to watch her every move with an unsettling intensity. He would ask her where she had been, who she had spoken to, and why she hadn't answered his calls immediately. At first, Emma brushed it off as protectiveness, but it didn't take long for it to become suffocating. He started discouraging her from seeing her friends, saying they were a bad influence or that they didn't understand the life they were building together. He insisted on managing their finances, claiming he was better suited for it given his experience. Slowly but surely, Emma found herself cut off from the people and things that had once grounded her. She turned to journaling as a way to process her feelings. Her entries, written late at night when Daniel was asleep, revealed a growing sense of unease. "I love him so much," she wrote in one entry, but I don't know if this is what love is supposed to feel like." In another, she described a fight they had, one of many that had started to become routine. "He gets so angry, and then he apologizes like it never happened. I want to believe him, but I feel like I'm losing myself." By the time their daughter, Lily, was born, Emma was a shadow of the girl she had once been. She adored her baby, but the weight of her marriage was crushing her. In her journal, she confessed that she had thought about leaving but couldn't bring herself to do it. "I stayed with him so Lily would have two parents," she wrote. "But I don't know how much longer I can do this." Emma's family noticed the change in her, though they didn't know the full extent of it. When they visited, Daniel was always polite but distant, as if he were tolerating their presence rather than welcoming it. Emma rarely spoke about her marriage, and when she did, it was in vague terms. Her mother once asked her if everything was okay, and Emma had smiled and said, "It's just hard being a new mom." But her eyes told a different story. Behind the glossy photos and carefully curated social media posts that painted a picture of a perfect life, Emma was struggling. And while she may have felt trapped, she never could have imagined just how dark her world would become, or how dangerous the man she had married truly was. As the investigation into Emma Rhodes' murder unfolded, the initial horror of the crime scene gave way to mounting suspicions. While Daniel Parker's account painted a chilling picture of a brutal home invasion, seasoned investigators couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The details, while plausible at first glance, began to fray at the edges the more they examined them. The first break in the case came with the arrest of Viktor Romanov, a Georgian national with a long history of violent crimes and burglaries. Romanov had been detained during a routine traffic stop near the state border just days after Emma's murder. His vehicle contained tools commonly associated with break-ins and a handgun similar to one Daniel had described. On paper, Romanov seemed like a perfect suspect. His criminal record, combined with his proximity to the scene, made him a person of interest almost immediately. Romanov was brought in for questioning and interrogated for hours. Detectives pressed him on his whereabouts the night of the murder, presenting him with the composite sketch based on Daniel's description of the intruders. While there were some vague similarities, Romanov denied any involvement in the crime. He maintained his innocence even as investigators applied increasing pressure, but the lack of concrete evidence quickly became a problem. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitness accounts linking him to the Parker home. After 4 days of exhaustive questioning, Romanov was released, his name cleared. The setback forced investigators to re-evaluate the case. With Romanov ruled out, they were left with more questions than answers. Their focus shifted back to the original account of the crime, specifically Daniel's detailed version of events. At first, his story had seemed harrowing and believable. But now, with no viable suspects, the inconsistencies in his narrative began to stand out. The first red flag was the issue of forced entry, or, rather, the lack of it. Daniel had claimed the intruders entered through the small basement window, but upon closer inspection, detectives realized this wasn't physically possible. The window was too narrow for a grown man to fit through, let alone multiple men carrying weapons and loot. It raised an obvious question: how did they get inside? And why would they bother with a window when the front door showed no signs of tampering? The more investigators pressed on this point, the more Daniel's answers seemed vague and evasive. Next came the security footage. The Parker home was equipped with several cameras, one of which was positioned in the living room where the alleged intruders had first entered. However, when investigators reviewed the footage, they discovered that the camera's memory card had been removed well before the supposed break-in. Digital timestamps revealed that the card was ejected at 1:20 a.m., nearly 3 hours before Daniel claimed the robbery occurred. This discovery sent up immediate alarms. If the intruders had been so meticulous as to remove the memory card, why hadn't they done so closer to the time of the crime? The timing didn't align, and it suggested that someone familiar with the camera system had tampered with it in advance. The most damning evidence, however, came from Emma's smartwatch. As part of her daily routine, Emma wore the device to track her activity in health metrics. Investigators retrieved the data from the night of her murder and found a chilling timeline. At 3:58 a.m., Emma's heart rate readings indicated she was asleep, with her pulse steady and calm. But by 4:05 a.m., her heart rate spiked dramatically, a clear sign of physical and emotional distress. At 4:11 a.m., her pulse flatlined, indicating that her heart had stopped. This information directly contradicted Daniel's claim that the intruders killed her closer to 4:30 a.m., and it narrowed the window of her time of death to a precise 7 minutes. If the smartwatch data wasn't incriminating enough, Daniel's fitness app provided the final nail in the coffin. Despite claiming he was tied up and unable to move, the app recorded movement data from his phone between 3:55 and 4:15 a.m., the exact time frame during which Emma was killed. It showed that he had taken several steps around the house, which made his story of being restrained and helpless impossible to believe. Piece by piece, the evidence began to dismantle Daniel's carefully crafted narrative. Detectives began noticing patterns in his behavior that aligned less with a grieving husband and more with someone trying to cover their tracks. His initial 911 call, while desperate sounding, now seemed rehearsed. His detailed description of the intruders, once seen as helpful, now felt oddly specific, as if he were trying too hard to sell a story. Faced with mounting contradictions, investigators decided it was time to confront Daniel. They brought him in for questioning under the guise of needing clarification on a few points in his statement. What followed was a grueling 8-hour interrogation, during which detectives laid out the evidence piece by piece. They presented the smartwatch data, the fitness app movements, the removed security footage, and the impossibility of forced entry. Each revelation chipped away at Daniel's composure, and his confident demeanor began to crumble. At first, he tried to explain away the inconsistencies. He claimed the fitness app data was a glitch, that the intruders must have removed the camera memory card earlier in the night to avoid detection, and that his account of the break-in had been muddled by the trauma of the event. But the excuses were flimsy, and the investigators pressed harder. Finally, when it became clear there was no way out, Daniel broke down. His voice cracked as he muttered, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." The room fell silent as the detectives waited for him to continue. Over the next several hours, Daniel's fabricated story unraveled completely. What he revealed was a chilling tale of premeditation, manipulation, and betrayal. Far from being the victim of a home invasion, Daniel had staged the entire event. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, but it was his own confession that turned the investigation on its head. The man who had once appeared as a grieving husband was now the prime suspect in a crime that would shock everyone who thought they knew him. The truth about what happened that night, and why, was more twisted and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Daniel Parker sat in the cold, fluorescent-lit interrogation room, his once confident facade completely shattered. The weight of the evidence had cornered him, and for the first time, his carefully constructed story began to unravel. At first, his words came out in fragmented whispers, but as the hours dragged on, the truth poured out. Dark, twisted, and almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. He began with a strained confession, admitting that Emma's death wasn't the result of a robbery gone wrong. There had been no masked intruders, no desperate fight to save his family. The story he'd spun, the one that had captivated the public and earned him sympathy, was nothing more than a fabrication. He killed her, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But the chilling part wasn't just the admission, it was how calculated his actions had been. According to Daniel, the night of Emma's murder began like so many others, with an argument. Emma had been growing distant for months, and he could feel her slipping away from him. That night, she confronted him directly, telling him she couldn't live like this anymore. She wanted to leave. She wanted to take their daughter, Lily, and start over. She had even been researching shelters and rental apartments, a fact that stung Daniel's ego more than anything else. To him, it wasn't just a threat to their marriage, it was an attack on his control, his authority, his image as the perfect husband and father. As Daniel recounted their argument, his voice took on an eerie tone, as if he were trying to justify his actions even now. He claimed Emma's words had pushed him to the brink, describing her as cold and dismissive, accusing her of undermining him as a husband. He painted himself as the victim, a man who had been driven to madness by a wife who didn't appreciate his sacrifices. But beneath his feigned sorrow, there was a chilling detachment, a lack of true remorse for what he had done. The fight escalated quickly, he said. Emma threatened to leave that very night, packing a bag for Lily and herself. Daniel tried to stop her, begging her to stay, but when she refused, something inside him snapped. He described the moment with a disturbing lack of emotion, as though he were recounting the actions of someone else. "I just couldn't let her go," he said, his hands trembling slightly. "She was taking everything from me." What happened next was nothing short of horrific. Daniel lunged at Emma, grabbing her by the neck as she tried to push him away. She fought back, her nails scratching at his arms, but he was stronger. He forced her onto the bed, pinning her down as she struggled beneath him. Her pleas for him to stop only seemed to fuel his rage. In a final act of desperation, she reached for the pillow, perhaps hoping to shield herself, but Daniel ripped it from her hands and pressed it down over her face with all his strength. It took minutes, agonizing, drawn-out minutes, for Emma's body to go still. Daniel described the moment she stopped struggling with an unsettling calm, as if he had rehearsed the story in his mind countless times. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't even pause as he recounted how he stood over her lifeless body, catching his breath. Instead, he shifted almost immediately into damage control, his mind racing to cover his tracks. The realization of what he had done didn't lead to panic. Instead, it ignited a cold, calculating plan. Daniel decided that the only way to protect himself was to fabricate a story so convincing, so tragic, that no one would question it. He would be the grieving husband, the sole survivor of a violent home invasion that claimed the life of his wife and left him bound and helpless. He started with the dog. Max, the family pet who had greeted him with wagging tails and unconditional love for years, was now nothing more than a liability. Daniel took the dog's leash, looped it around Max's neck, and pulled. It was quick, he said, almost mechanical, as though he were performing a chore rather than taking a life. The act, while unnecessary, added another layer of brutality to his staged crime scene, a detail he knew would evoke horror and sympathy from anyone who heard about it. Next, he turned his attention to the house. Daniel ransacked the rooms, pulling drawers from dressers and scattering their contents across the floor. He overturned furniture, slashed cushions, and emptied jewelry boxes, creating the illusion of a chaotic burglary. He took $10,000 in cash from the Monopoly box and hid it, along with Emma's jewelry, in a spot investigators wouldn't think to look. Finally, he staged his own restraints. Using rope and duct tape he found in the garage, Daniel tied his hands and feet, leaving enough slack to free himself later. He wrapped the tape around his mouth and eyes, carefully ensuring it wouldn't obstruct his breathing. When everything was in place, he laid on the floor beside the bed where Emma's body lay, closed his eyes, and waited. He described those moments with an unsettling detachment, as though he were watching himself from a distance. When he felt enough time had passed, Daniel began the final act of his performance. Using his nose, he nudged his phone across the floor until he could press the emergency dial button. The call he made to 911, the one that had painted him as a desperate, grieving husband, was just another part of his script. Every muffled word, every cry for help, was rehearsed, designed to sell the story he had so carefully constructed. But what made Daniel's confession even more chilling was his attempt to shift the blame onto Emma. He painted her as the antagonist, a woman who had driven him to the edge with her demands and threats. He claimed he had been unstable for months, a victim of emotional abuse and manipulation, and that the argument that night had been the breaking point. "She pushed me too far," he said, as though that excuse could somehow absolve him of the heinous crime he had committed. As Daniel's words filled the interrogation room, the detectives listened in silence, their faces betraying none of the anger and disgust they felt. This wasn't just a confession. It was a window into the mind of a man who had calculated every move, manipulated everyone around him, and thought he could get away with murder. What Daniel didn't realize was that his own arrogance had been his undoing. The evidence, the inconsistencies, and the lies he had told would be his downfall. By the time he finished speaking, the room felt heavy, as though the air itself had absorbed the weight of his crimes. Daniel Parker, the grieving husband who had captured the sympathy of a community, had revealed himself for what he truly was, a man capable of the ultimate betrayal. Emma Rhodes had trusted him, loved him, and built her life around him. And in return, he had taken everything from her. When the truth about Daniel Parker's heinous actions came to light, it sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community of Fairview Hills, and far beyond. The image of Daniel as the heartbroken husband, a man who had seemingly survived a horrific home invasion only to lose everything, crumbled in an instant. The public, who had rallied behind him with an outpouring of sympathy, was left stunned and horrified. This wasn't just a case of murder, it was a calculated betrayal on a scale that defied comprehension. The media descended on the story with relentless fervor. Headlines screamed about the deceptive husband and the murder that fooled the world. News anchors dissected every detail of Daniel's confession, his attempts to manipulate the narrative, and the overwhelming evidence that had led to his downfall. Commentators debated how someone could carry out such a cold, calculated act against their own family. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that captivated the world, it was the audacity of the cover-up, the lengths to which Daniel had gone to paint himself as a victim while standing over the ruin he had created. Neighbors, friends, and even distant acquaintances of the couple were interviewed, their shock and disbelief echoing across television screens and social media platforms. "He seemed so devoted," one neighbor said, shaking her head. "I never would have imagined he was capable of something like this." Another added, "They looked like the perfect family. We all felt so sorry for him, and now we realize it was all a lie." Emma's family, devastated beyond words, released a statement shortly after Daniel's confession was made public. They spoke of Emma's vibrant spirit, her love for the ocean, and her dreams of creating a better life for her daughter. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that the man they had trusted to love and protect her had been the one to take her life. "We will never forgive him," Emma's mother, Linda, said in an emotional interview. "He stole our daughter from us. He stole Lily's mother. He stole everything." In the weeks leading up to the trial, public outrage reached a fever pitch. People demanded justice for Emma and Lily, for Max the dog, and for the lives Daniel had so callously destroyed. Protests were held outside the courthouse, with signs reading, "Justice for Emma," and "Lily deserved better." The case became a symbol of betrayal and manipulation, a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust. When the trial began in May 2022, the courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public eager to see justice served. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, detailing the timeline of events, the inconsistencies in Daniel's story, and the damning digital footprints that exposed his lies. They played the audio of his 911 call, juxtaposing it with the cold, calculated confession he later gave to police. Every piece of evidence painted a chilling portrait of a man who had meticulously planned to escape accountability, only to be undone by his own arrogance. The defense, desperate to sway the jury, attempted to portray Daniel as a man pushed to the brink by a toxic relationship. They claimed he had acted in a moment of passion, driven by fear of losing his daughter. But the jury was unmoved. The evidence of premeditation was irrefutable, and Daniel's attempt to shift blame onto Emma only further solidified his guilt in the eyes of the court. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before reaching a unanimous verdict. Daniel Parker was found guilty of premeditated murder, obstruction of justice, and animal abuse. The judge, addressing Daniel directly during sentencing, described his actions as the epitome of cruelty and betrayal. He sentenced Daniel to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and emotion. Emma's family wept openly, holding one another as they finally heard the words they had been waiting for. Outside, supporters cheered as news of the verdict spread. Justice had been served, but the wounds left by Daniel's actions would take a lifetime to heal. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, he remained silent, his face expressionless. For a man who had spent so much time crafting a narrative to manipulate those around him, there were no words left to say. The world now saw him for what he truly was, a man who had betrayed the very people who had loved and trusted him most. Emma's story became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of the dangers that can hide behind a seemingly perfect facade. Her family, determined to honor her memory, set up a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic abuse and raising awareness about the warning signs of controlling behavior. Through their efforts, Emma's legacy would live on, not as the victim of Daniel Parker's ultimate betrayal, but as a symbol of hope and resilience for others. Emma Rhodes' story is one of stolen potential, trust betrayed, and the devastating consequences of a life cut short by the very person who was supposed to protect and cherish her. She had been a bright light, a young woman with dreams as vast as the ocean she loved. Her laughter had filled the lives of those who knew her, her compassion touching even strangers. But all of that was extinguished by a man whose actions revealed a darkness no one had seen coming. Emma's daughter, Lily, would grow up without her mother's warmth and guidance, left with only photographs and fragmented memories of the life they shared. She would never hear Emma's voice again, never feel her comforting embrace. Instead, Lily would carry the weight of her father's unforgivable choices, a legacy of betrayal that no child should have to endure. The innocent baby who once reached out to wake her mother would grow up with questions, scars, and a longing for the love that had been cruelly taken from her. For Emma's family, the grief was immeasurable. They had lost more than a daughter and sister, they had lost a piece of their hearts. The knowledge that Emma had suffered, that her final moments were filled with fear and betrayal, haunted them. They replayed the signs they had missed, the subtle changes in her demeanor, the things she hadn't said. They had trusted Daniel, welcomed him into their lives, and now that trust felt like a cruel mockery. They would never truly heal, though they tried to find solace in the memories of who Emma had been and the impact she had on everyone around her. The case itself became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the masks people can wear and the darkness that can lurk behind a polished exterior. It shattered the illusion that love and devotion could shield someone from harm. The world was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the most charming, seemingly perfect individuals could harbor unspeakable intentions. The community of Fairview Hills, once idyllic and unassuming, would never be the same. The case lingered like a shadow over its residents, a chilling reminder that tragedy could strike even in the most peaceful of places. Emma's story wasn't just about the betrayal of a husband, it was about the cracks in relationships that often go unnoticed until it's too late. It was about the subtle erosion of autonomy, the isolation that can come disguised as care, and the manipulation that twists love into control. Her life and death became a call to action for anyone who saw themselves in her story, a plea to recognize the warning signs and to seek help before it was too late. In the years that followed, the foundation her family created in her honor became a beacon of hope for others. It provided resources for victims of domestic abuse, offering them a way out of dangerous situations. Through their work, Emma's legacy became one of strength and resilience. She could no longer fight for herself, but her story gave others the courage to fight for their own safety and freedom. For Daniel, there would be no redemption. His name became synonymous with betrayal and cruelty, a man whose actions stripped him of any semblance of humanity. In prison, he would have no audience for his manipulations, no one to charm or deceive. He would spend the rest of his life with the weight of his crimes, knowing that he had destroyed not only Emma's life but countless others in the process. His punishment, while just, could never undo the damage he had inflicted. Emma Rhodes' story serves as a haunting reminder of how appearances can deceive and how dangerous blind trust can be. It forces us to look beyond the surface, to question what lies beneath the smiles and the stories people tell. It reminds us that the most chilling betrayals often come not from strangers, but from those we hold closest to our hearts. Though Emma is gone, her voice echoes in the lessons her life and death have taught the world. She will be remembered not as a victim, but as a symbol of the fight for truth, justice, and the courage to stand against those who would use love as a weapon. In her memory, the world continues to learn, to grow, and to strive for a future where no one else has to suffer the way she did.